It's a big day for voters in Pennsylvania. It is the last day of voting for the state's closed primaries. Polls opened at 7 a.m. Eastern today, set to close at 8 p.m. tonight. But you do not have to be a Pennsylvanian to care about how this election turns out. A lot of eyes on this state this pivotal election year because from the election administration world's perspective, obviously this is a key swing state we're talking about, but also this is a state that has gone through a lot of transformation of its election system in a lot of ways. And it's representative of how voting access and voting patterns have changed around the country. Just one stat 895,000 mail in ballots sent out by county officials around the state, more than 563,000 received as of yesterday morning, according to the Secretary of Commonwealth, Al Schmidt. We're going to get into what all this means for voters, as well as election officials in Pennsylvania and around the country. Thank you for joining us. But let me first introduce to you to our panelists. Today, we're going to hear from David Becker. David is the executive director and founder, of CEIR. He's written a book called The Big Truth: Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. He's more than 25 years of experience in elections. And before he founded CEIR, he served as senior attorney with the U.S. Justice Department's voting section in both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He's also led the elections team at the Pew Charitable Trust. You're also going to hear from Lauren Cristella. Lauren is the president and CEO of the Committee of 70, which she joined in 2018 and was named president and CEO in June of last year. Lauren has served as president of the League of Women Voters of Philadelphia and has also held positions at the University of Pennsylvania's Fels Institute of Government and the National Constitution Center. Philadelphia is in the house today. So we're going to get into what's happening in election administration in Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. And I guess I'll start with David, if you don't mind. And Lauren, I'll give you this question too. When you think about election administration in the state of Pennsylvania, what are 2-3 words that come to mind?
I might not be able to put it into just 2 or 3 words, but one of the things that's most remarkable about Pennsylvania, and I should say my organization, the Center for Election Innovation and Research, or CEIR, we work with election officials all over the country, both parties at the state and local level, to help them run elections that voters should trust and do trust. And one of the things that's most striking about Pennsylvania that we've seen in our research, and as we've just worked closely with election officials there, is Pennsylvania is a state that prior to 2020 was still stuck in kind of 19th and 20th century voting models, much as a lot of the Northeast was at that time, where almost everyone voted on election day, where many counties were voting on voting machines, and I use that term very, very loosely, that were akin to lever machines or electric lever machines, basically, where that had been built maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. And in just a short period of time, and very fortunately, really, given the pandemic coming in 2020, Pennsylvania, on a bipartisan basis, moved forward into the 21st century. They began offering mail voting to anyone in the Commonwealth, regardless of whether they had an excuse. That's something that is very common across the United States. 37 states allow for no excuse mail voting as we sit here today. They allowed for everyone to vote early in person through in-person absentee voting processes, which also is very common, actually, in 46 states as we sit here today. Only 4 states don't offer some form of that. And they moved away from these kind of unauditable electric machines that were very common in places like Philadelphia to paper ballots. So now every single voter in Pennsylvania votes a paper ballot. That happened between the 2016 and 2020 elections. And that is a highly secure best practice that almost everyone in the country has. 95% of all voters in the United States vote on paper ballots. And what that enables us to do is, after the voter has left, to still have a secret ballot that we can go back to and confirm was the same ballot that the ballot looked at. And then at the same time, look at that paper and compare it to the machine counts. Audit that paper to make sure the counts that we have match what the machines do. Pennsylvania's done a really remarkable job of that. They didn't have that capability statewide prior to 2020. And so voters in Pennsylvania today, in just we're talking about 5 years ago, basically, have more choice in how they vote. They can vote by mail. They can vote early in person by getting an in-person absentee ballot, or still vote on election day if they so choose. And they can have more confidence in that vote because they're voting on paper ballots that can be recounted and audited multiple times. It's really a remarkable transformation in a short period of time. Other states, particularly Western states that have been doing this for a long time, evolved into that over time, over sometimes even decades. And Pennsylvania, to be able to pull that off in a short period of time, also with a highly divisive election during this time, and also, of course, with a pandemic, it's a real testament to the election officials throughout the state, all over, who somehow managed that process.
So Dave, I'm hearing word choice. I'm hearing paper ballots, and I think 2020, you pointed that as a pivotal year. A lot of folks obviously are thinking about COVID. How much did COVID push this? But again, as I think you talked about, David, in Pennsylvania, even if the COVID pandemic didn't happen in 2020, we would have seen a lot of these changes because there was a state law that was passed, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of talk out there about changes made due to COVID, and sometimes losing candidates has spread lies about that to try to breed doubt. What happened in Pennsylvania and in many other states, but Pennsylvania specifically, most of these changes came about as a result of a law that was passed in late 2019. And that law was passed on a bipartisan basis. Republicans overwhelmingly supported that law, and it enabled Pennsylvania to move towards, for instance, offering mail voting without an excuse, and early absentee voting. And again, how fortunate was that to be able to have that done on the regular legislative calendar, considered as it was, and give election officials at least a few months to prepare for that before the pandemic hit. And they really had to get that right, because what we know across the country, and in Pennsylvania, this was certainly true as well, the pandemic caused many voters who really wanted to turn out. We saw the highest turnout nationwide in 2020. We saw the highest turnout in Pennsylvania history in 2020. So voters really wanted to turn out despite the pandemic, but nobody wanted them to feel like they had to risk their lives to do it, or to feel unsafe when they were doing it. And so the ability for voters to have choice, to vote in a way that they felt comfortable, either in person early, and oftentimes in larger sites where they could be socially distant, to vote by mail, were important options at that time.
I should note the voting options, mail-in voting, that access. A lot of, as you said, a lot of support from Republican state lawmakers when that law was initially passed. And then a few years later, you see lawsuits filed by some of those same Republican state lawmakers who proposed and passed and voted for the bill, then saying it was unconstitutional according to PA state constitution. So a lot of political controversy there. But we can get back to that. But Lauren, I want to hear from you. What are 2, 3 words, phrases that come to mind for you when you think about election administration in Pennsylvania?
My two would be trustworthy and battle tested. I'll take hyphenates. They have certainly adapted to the changes that I think that that David talked about in October of 2019 when that law was passed. It was the greatest set of reforms to Pennsylvania's election code since 1937. And I think our administrators were anticipating kind of a slow uptake on the mail-in voting. It was nice that it was an option that was given in exchange, right? The negotiating that happened in our state house was first the elimination of single ticket voting, which also had a huge impact in Pennsylvania in 2020, as much as the mail-in voting did, right? We had close to half, if not over half, of all ballots were mail-in ballots because of the pandemic. That number has settled into 25-30% of the voting turnout right now. But we also saw split tickets, right? The down ballot races in Pennsylvania overwhelmingly went towards Republicans in our state row offices, those elections, even though Joe Biden won in 2020. So both of those changes had a big impact, certainly on our state here. But there were unintended consequences of that bill as well. Things like the secrecy envelope requirement, right? That you have to put your mail-in ballot inside a blank envelope that then goes inside the mailing envelope. That is written into the law. It's kind of immaterial to the validity of the vote. It'd be the equivalent of if somebody forgets their secrecy envelope or chooses not to use it, it would be the same as shouting who you're voting for in the middle of your polling place. No one's going to stop you from doing it. It might not be the wisest choice, but right now that's what the law says. So thousands of ballots are invalidated because people forget to use that. I had a friend call me up and say, "Oh no, I just found my secrecy envelope on my kitchen table. I already sent in my ballot. What do I do?" Right? And you have to go in person to the election office to remedy that. So that's one. There's all this controversy about the dating of the ballot. That's also in the law as required for some time, right? After 2020, the interpretation was that it could be any date as long as it was dated. So some people were accidentally putting their birth date, other things like that. Now the rules have been clarified to be, the specific time between when the ballot was printed and when it has to be received. But that's in court right now. So the Committee of 70 signed on as an amicus to the NAACP's lawsuit against the state, saying that these are immaterial and it's disproportionately discriminating against people of color and older Pennsylvanians.
And this,
Yep.
Go
No.
ahead, please.
No, I was just saying, so we're, that's the unintended consequences of Act 77. And then of course, the political narrative around mail-in voting has complicated things further.
Yeah. That case you're just mentioning about the quote unquote undated ballots, which again are postmarked and arrive on time, but do not have that handwritten date underneath the voter's signature. Very controversial currently at the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and all signs point to a potential appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court eventually, and could set a precedent regarding what's known as the materiality provision of the Civil Rights Act, which can have implications on other areas of election law going forward. But how is that, from your perspective, Lauren, this controversy, which is very specific to mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania, but this case specifically could have resonance around the country? How is that just complicating, from what you're hearing from election officials, their work, their day-to-day as they prepare for a major election year, a major general election, when I just talked about hundreds of thousands of mail-in ballots, a lot more probably coming in later this year for folks?
For sure. I think what we're hearing from election administrators is just they want clarity and they want the rules to be set and stop changing. I mean, from their perspective, they'll handle the rules. They're not political people in a lot of these positions. They want to know what the rules are, be clear with the public about what those rules are, and then execute the election. So clarity, no more back and forth, and making them as efficient and effective as possible is really the priority of our election administrators here.
Now, I remember you were saying battle tested was one of the words you think about for Pennsylvania's election administration system. And I wonder what are some, for our election officials who are joining us today, what are some takeaways that you think, given that there have been so many political battles, legal battles in Pennsylvania over these past years about specifically various aspects of election administration? What do you think Pennsylvania officials have learned or are still trying to figure out that could be takeaways for election officials in other parts of the country?
I think the partnerships with local organizations who can help amplify the rules of the game, the messages, and provide that transparency. A lot of our election officials have adequate staffing to pull off the elections, but they don't have these elaborate comms teams to go out and do public engagement campaigns, right? Their job is to pull off these elections with integrity. But it's essential to show how that process works, to be as transparent as possible. And that's where groups like the Committee of 70 and other partners across the state can really step up and help without and partner and just get the word out about it without violating another law that was passed here in Pennsylvania, Act 88, that bans election officials taking, material support, whether resources or funding from outside groups. But we've managed to be a good communication piece, I think, for our election administrators so that the public can have that trust in their government.
Yeah. So we said at the top, it is the last day of voting for the closed primaries in Pennsylvania, and all signs turn out as fairly typical for, well, this is kind of an atypical major election year, actually. But I wonder, as you're both looking ahead for the general election, what are some trends, patterns, concerns that you have in Pennsylvania that you think may be happening in other states as well?
Do you want me to start with that, Hansi?
Please.
Okay, sure. So I think, and Lauren kind of alluded to this, Pennsylvania election officials and voters have been processing a lot of change in a very small period of time. And they've done it really admirably well, considering how difficult that is and how much scrutiny has been on Pennsylvania. I expect that given that scrutiny is going to continue for sure, regardless of the margins in all likelihood, that there will be continued efforts to try to depress confidence in the election process, particularly by candidates who might think they're going to lose. And so there might be efforts to take all of this newness to some of the things that are happening in Pennsylvania, as well run as they are, and try to leverage that into doubt, especially among supporters of whoever the losing candidate is. And that can be a really dangerous position. And we've seen that in Pennsylvania for the last 3+ years, where there have been individuals, sometimes even legislators, who have spread lies about the election process, who spread lies about the possibility of fraud and other things, when Pennsylvania elections right now, as we sit here today, are as secure and transparent as they've ever been. That's remarkable. I mean, there's going to continue to be improvement, and there are things that we need to resolve, like uncertainty about things like these undated ballots. That's a really good point that was brought up. I mean, if you have a ballot that was received by the voter and returned prior to the close of the polls on election night, that date doesn't really tell election officials anything else they need to know. They need the signature, of course. They need the signature to verify identity. They need other pieces of information, but that date really doesn't tell the election officials anything more. You know that the ballot got there in time. Even if there's no postmark on the envelope, it's there. You have it physically in your hand. You can evaluate it for validity. And so hopefully we'll see courts give clear indications on this, but regardless about what the rules are, getting clarity on those rules as far in advance of the election is important for election officials and voters. You might not like all of the rules, but as long as they're set, then there's nothing that either side, and particularly the losing side, can complain about afterwards. This is one of the problems that Pennsylvania faced in 2020, because it was one of those rare places where courts kind of left one of those rules up in the air going into the election, and that was whether or not ballots that arrived several days after election day could still be counted. And I know a lot of us, and I spoke with Lauren and her colleagues at Committee of 70 about this, and I spoke with election officials throughout the state, and there was a real effort to try to educate voters to get their ballots in by election day, regardless of what the uncertainty about that extra few days was going to be, so that we could minimize the number of ballots that might be at issue in that decision, and hopefully get it well below whatever the margin of victory was. That was another huge success for everyone in the state of Pennsylvania, election officials, groups like Lauren's, the Committee of 70, the media, and voters especially, because we saw a margin of victory in 2020, in the presidential race at least, of 84,000 ballots, and there were only about 10,000 of those late arriving mail ballots statewide. So being able to reduce the ability of losing candidates to use that as a lever to kind of breed doubt about the process is really important. And the better we can make those rules certain by the time November 5th comes around, so that there's no doubt about which ballots are going to be counted and how, makes it a lot easier. We still should anticipate the losing candidate may deny the results of the election, but it makes it harder for that to lead to instability, I think.
Thank you, David. And I'll just point out real quick, one of the rules that makes that quote unquote undated ballots case so complicated is that it is Pennsylvania state law to have a date underneath of a voter's signature on that outer envelope. And so that is part of the legal controversy there. But Lauren, what are some of the challenges, or what is on your mind as the general election gets closer?
Really explaining to people that we don't have pre-canvassing here. Other states that have large numbers of mail-in ballots come in, they can start prepping those. They don't tabulate them or count the ballots until election day, but they can do all that prep work days and if not weeks in advance. And our law right now has it that process can't start until 7 a.m. on election day, which is why the nation, the world, waits for Pennsylvania's votes to be counted. Because the number of ballots should be mail-in ballots should be less than it was in 2020, because our systems are a little bit more efficient, the equipment is there now, everyone knows what they're doing. The counting should probably finish up by Wednesday evening. We'll have those results. But we did a poll just a few months ago that basically said 66% of Pennsylvanians question the integrity of the elections if the results are delayed. Right. And that's just such a simple thing that we could have fixed. But it really is an education campaign to get the word out that there is nothing nefarious about why it's taking longer for Pennsylvania's votes to be counted. It's just the rules and how our election officials are forced to operate in a very constrained timeline.
And if you can give us any insight, Lauren, into Harrisburg and what's going on over there, because I know there have been proposals, there have been efforts to try to get pre-canvassing to start earlier. What's the status of that right now in Pennsylvania's state capital?
Oh man, we came so close in October. We were so close to getting pre-canvassing, to getting the secrecy envelope address issue taken care of, the dating, all of that, risk limiting audits, you name it. And it was going to be in exchange for a version of voter ID that every first-time voter in Pennsylvania has to adhere to, right? If you're new to your voting division or if you're a first-time voter, there's a long list of different IDs you can present. And in our opinion, at the Committee of 70, that was a good trade, right? We didn't think that would really that type of voter ID wouldn't really disenfranchise anyone, given the huge improvements in election administration and the ballots that would be saved, from the secrecy envelope disqualifications and the dating issues. It came very close. And then someone added permanent mail-in voting to the bill, and that it crushed it under its own weight. So they couldn't come up with a deal. And that was really and it would have also moved the primary date from today because it's Passover. There was a huge effort to move this date. They couldn't get it done. So they couldn't. And then that basically was the last window. We were just talking about how it changes to our administration late in the game end up making more problems than they solve in a lot of instances. So that really closed, I think that was the last chance we had, that closed the door on election reform ahead of the 2024 general election.
So this would be a post-2024 reform if it were to pass.
Yes,
something
we have not stopped fighting for it, that's for sure. The fight for that continues. The same with opening up Pennsylvania's primaries, right? Anybody registered independent or with a third-party candidate today can't vote on candidates. They can only vote on ballot questions. We're one of 10 closed primary states. So those fights continue, and with the hope that they would be enacted in 2025.
Thank you.
And Hansi, can I
Please.
make a quick comment about about this counting ballots faster and pre-canvassing issue? Because I think
Please do.
It's such an important one in Pennsylvania. So first of all, we should say that we've always, as a nation, taken a while to count ballots, particularly in a presidential race. We just think we get to know who won the presidency on election night, but we've never actually known. And that's because it takes weeks to accurately count all of the ballots and all of the races that we have on those ballots. We have the most complicated ballots in the world in the United States, with dozens of races on multiple pages. And to get all of that right, to audit it properly, to recount it properly, to make sure we wait for military ballots to come in and review provisional ballots, all of that takes time. And the reason we have thought we knew who the winner was before was because margins were larger, and those ballots never decided the race. For those of you that don't know, you will hear every major network call California at 11 p.m. Eastern time, 8 p.m. Pacific time on election night for Joe Biden in all likelihood. And the reality is California will have counted virtually none of its ballots by that time. It's just the margins we know will be very, very large. In a state like Pennsylvania, the margins are going to be much, much narrower. And so it's normal. It means the election officials are doing their job when this takes some time. But that being said, we can always help them with better policies to get this done faster than they might otherwise. And Pennsylvania still remains as one of the very, very small number of states that doesn't allow election officials to begin to pre-canvass, which means to validate the outside of the envelope, confirm the voter returned a proper mail ballot, make sure there weren't any problems, and load it up in a tabulator so that we can get a report on the tabulation as soon as the polls close when it's legal to do so. That is a practice that is adopted almost everywhere, red states, blue states, all across the country. And famously in 2020, there were 3 states, Pennsylvania being one of them, Michigan and Wisconsin being the other, that didn't really allow much pre-canvassing. Michigan at the last minute allowed 1 day of pre-canvassing, and that led to delays in their reporting. Michigan has since adopted pretty broad pre-canvassing. They're going to be pre-canvassing pretty much all of the mail ballots that come in before Election Day will be reported out very shortly after the polls close. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania still remain outliers in this, where they're going to have to wait until Election Day to start processing them. And that is compounded by the fact that every state has this challenge when mail ballots come in on Election Day. You can't pre-canvass a ballot you don't have yet. So when ballots come in on Election Day at the last minute, that adds to workload. So when you've got so much workload in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin concentrated on Election Day and the immediate days afterwards, and you've got all these late arriving ballots, that's going to lead to a little more time. And I just ask everyone, be patient, understand that that's what election officials are required to do under the laws of the state of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, as it turns out. And if the margins are very, very narrow, we're just going to have to wait for them to get it done right rather than to kind of force things and get it done fast.
Thank you for that. We're going to have to potentially hold our breath a little bit longer in Pennsylvania later on this year. I want to get to our viewers' questions, and I'm going to start with a real quick one that I could probably answer myself, which is, can we get a reference citation to the new case Lauren mentioned that is being brought by the NAACP and others? I think it's about the quote-unquote undated ballots case, and that is the Pennsylvania State Conference of the NAACP versus Secretary of the Commonwealth. And if you're looking up the Third Circuit docket, it's case 23-3166. I think that's right, Lauren. All right. Let's get to a question that Lauren and David can answer from our Q&A chat here. I would love to hear the panelists' thoughts about the impact of county-level election administration decisions and how they can play a role in the election. Things like deciding how many voting locations are available, the hours they are open, whether or not drop box is available. I've seen cases in the news, cases where county level officials have chosen not to provide things like a drop box, despite the community overwhelmingly supporting it. Do the panelists have any concerns about these locally elected commissioners and the decisions they make about local voting options? Lauren or David?
You want to go first this time, Lauren?
Sure. By and large, I am not very concerned. Our election directors are operating with integrity. They want to get this job done. There's political decisions being made about drop box locations, if they have them at all, things like that, that we could address on a state level, which I think would be really helpful to just take that out of the local politics. But often that's county commissioners deciding, not necessarily the election officials deciding about whether or not to have them in general. I think by and large, we've only heard a few complaints or issues of this happening across Pennsylvania. In most instances, it's a balance between security and access, right? They want things to be as easy as possible, but also secure as possible. And there's a lot of rules around what you need to have a drop box, right? They have to be the security that they have to have, the 24/7 monitoring, all of that, staffing to go around every night and empty those drop boxes. It's not always just an effort to minimize access for voters. Sometimes it is really just a staffing and logistics problem on the county side. So I think a little bit of further digging and understanding what the election officials are going through is needed for things like that too.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that first of all, I'd say generally it is better when you can standardize things within a state to the degree possible. When you can get clear rules well in advance of the election, and that can be done through the proper legislative process, working with election officials and others. That's always preferable. It's much less preferable when there's variation between the counties, individuals in one county perhaps having what's perceived to be slightly more access than those in another. But all that said, I will also say I think this is often overstated as a concern with regard to voters navigating the process. What we have found in our research is that voters tend to adapt to whatever they have available, as long as they meet a basic threshold for voter access. And we also have a really good sense of what that threshold is. Again, while there have been there's a general kind of back and forth between the left and the right over whether voting is hard or voting is rigged. Those narratives don't really reflect the reality. Voting right now in the United States is easier than it has ever been before. We released a report on this last month. If you look at the period of time from 2000 to 2024, or 2024, about 40% of all Americans had access to voting by mail without an excuse or voting early if they so choose in 2000. Today, as we sit here, that percentage is 97%, all but voters in 4 states, Alabama, Mississippi, New Hampshire, and Delaware. And Delaware's trying. They just have a state constitutional issue that they have to navigate. But that's really remarkable. It's easier to register to vote than ever before. More voters have access to same-day registration than ever before in the United States. Virtually all the states offer some form of online voter registration. There's more automatic voter registration than ever before. It's incredibly easy to get registered. It's incredibly easy to vote. And most voters perceive that. And I think it's really important for voters to understand that while there might be variations between counties and there might be people on the extremes who are trying to get you worried about one thing or the other, that well over 95% of all voters in the United States, when they go to vote, we have survey data that goes back years on this, have a really positive experience. Virtually nobody waits in line more than 30 minutes. When they do wait in line for 30 minutes, it's often by choice. Sometimes they want to go on the first day of early voting when they know they're going to have longer lines in some places. And sometimes it's a community event. But in most cases, that just doesn't happen. And I think it's also really important to recognize that a presidential election is the only time in a 4-year period where more than half the eligible electorate shows up and votes. And that means that about 30 to 40% of the people who show up in November are going to be infrequent voters. They're going to default to not voting most of the time. And a lot of them are not voting today or in the days leading up to the primary. Most of the people who vote in November will have played no role in the primary at all. And so I think narratives where we kind of overstate the variations and the differences between states and counties and make it appear as if it's harder in some places than others often are not only all that accurate from the perspective of the voter, but also could have a negative impact on how they perceive their opportunity to express their voice in our democracy. And I really want voters to understand that, especially in Pennsylvania, especially compared to what it was just 6 years ago, Pennsylvanians have a lot of options. It's really easy to vote in Pennsylvania today. Now, that being said, I expect that thanks to the work of the Committee of 70 and many others, that it's going to be even better and more convenient in 2026 and 2028, but it's really good in 2024.
I want to turn to a question we received during the registration period. Someone wrote in, I'd like to learn about what other counties around the country are doing in regard to vote center management.
You want me to start with a national kind of perspective, Lauren, and then you know a lot more about what's going on in Pennsylvania. So vote centers, for those of you that aren't aware, are a really great innovation, I think. It is a way for voters to vote anywhere within a county. They don't just have to vote at their one local precinct, but they can vote, for instance, if there's a voting location in their county that's closer to where they work, they can vote there. If they're happening to go to the grocery store and there's a vote center nearby there, they can vote there. And part of the reason we can do this is also due to some technological improvements like electronic poll books and other things that enable us to mark down when someone has voted, no matter where they happen to be voting, so they can't go vote somewhere else again. And so a lot of places in the United States, and it's not just blue states or red states, it's both. California offers this, Texas offers this, Colorado offers this. A lot of places in the United States offer this, especially for early voting, where there might be multiple locations. There's almost everywhere where there's early voting, where there's more than one location, these are vote centers. Georgia offers vote centers for early voting, and it just offers a lot of convenience for voters. And I think that the person who asked the question is quite right. This is a relatively new innovation, and states are still figuring out how to do this to make sure that the integrity is there, and they're doing a really good job with that to make sure voters can't go vote in a vote center and get another ballot somehow. and that these are well run and well positioned for voters where they might need them, where they might use them over time. Vote centers are also often really facilitated by the use of things like ballot marking devices, touchscreen interfaces, which allow for the printing of a ballot after you indicate on the touchscreen how you'd like to do that. Because you can imagine if you're in a large county, there are what's called ballot styles for every single piece of political geography, a precinct. And in large jurisdictions, there might be thousands of ballot styles. And in some, they also have to be able to be printed in multiple languages. So to be able to have an electronic interface that allows you to print out a paper ballot enables you to manage that volume of different ballot styles in a single location when someone might come from anywhere in the county to do it. So those kinds of technological innovations have really enabled us to allow this level of convenience. But I think the questioner brings up a good point. There's probably more opportunities to share best practices across the various jurisdictions that are doing this. It's probably an innovation that's only really been widespread use for about a dozen years.
And speaking specifically to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, even more in particular, we don't have early voting per se, right? We have the ability to fill out that mail-in ballot on site, typically at City Hall at the election office. You can request it, fill it out and submit it, return it right back, all in the same, process. Now, our Philadelphia County has expanded that beyond City Hall. They have announced that there will be 10 permanent satellite election offices across Philadelphia. We had temporary satellite election offices in 2020 where people could do the same mail-in voting process, register to vote. It was conveniently kind of in big high schools across the city because they were all closed during the pandemic. But the city has now created 10 permanent locations. One is already opened. The rest will be open before the fall election, where you can do all of these things, check your registration, register to vote, update information, submit your mail-in ballot, correct all of these things. And that's going to be a 365 operation. So that's not just for an early voting period. That'll be every day, all year, permanently. In each of our council districts, which is fantastic innovation here for election access and support in the neighborhoods where people are. So that's our version, and one day hopefully we'll get proper voting centers where you can go and cast a ballot on on a voting machine, not just through the mail-in balloting process.
And Lauren, while you're speaking about Philly, I guess we should, well, I wanted to mention Philadelphia is one of the places around the country under new Voting Rights Act Section 203 requirements that there is an additional language that is now required by the federal government under the Voting Rights Act, Chinese. Is that right?
Correct. We have Spanish and now Mandarin, and I think they're offering in both traditional and simplified now, which is even better than it was 2 years ago. But we're excited about it, and we're partnering with a ton of different groups that serve these communities across the state, not just in Philadelphia, but certainly in Philadelphia where it's required. There are a lot of Spanish speakers and Mandarin speakers and everything else across the state too. But it is a lot of work, and this is another place where access to no excuse mail-in balloting has been really important. Some people, when they have that language barrier or English as a second language, they're intimidated, or they think that they're going to be given a hard time at polling places. There might not be an interpreter, even if all the materials printed are in their native language. They like to sit with the ballot in their language, ask questions, fill it out with a family member, things like that, where they can look it up with their phone, as anyone else would. But we do know that there has been a more popular uptake in those communities as well.
I'm going to turn to a question we got in our Q&A here. This is the ability for voters to cure any issues with their mail ballots, that is missing signature or dates, is dependent on which county they live in and whether the county commission allows their election board to notify voters of errors that need to be fixed. What are the prospects for establishing statewide curing guidelines in Pennsylvania?
Oh man, that's been high up on our list, a notice and cure process. Some counties do interpret the law as like they can't touch the ballots until 7 a.m. on election day, which would prevent that notifying and, identifying issues and notifying the voters. Philadelphia is pretty proactive about that. And there's been a list published probably 10 days ago, maybe more, that was notifying voters of any potential issues, missing signature, missing date, you name it. And then groups like ours take that list and try to run with it as best as we can, notifying people and getting the word out. But really having a simple notice and cure process that was statewide and would streamline those steps for a voter to remedy their ballot would be a fantastic improvement here in Pennsylvania for sure.
Yeah, and for the national perspective, it's very common to have what's called a notice and cure process where look, it's very simple. I certainly hope it won't be interpreted as against Pennsylvania law for an election official to notice a missing date on the outside of the envelope. That would just be good practice. It's done almost everywhere where that voter would then be notified to say, hey, you don't have your date. Can you come down to our office and provide the date? You've left your signature off. Can you come down and provide the signature? It's an important courtety that goes beyond just being nice. It also helps facilitate their right to vote. How long that notice and cure period might last is certainly up to the state legislatures to decide. But I should note it's very, very common to not have mail voting or voting in general be viewed as a game of gotcha, where the election officials, or I'm sorry, where voters have to jump through these particular hoops in particular ways that don't really bear any rational relation to the integrity of the process. And I think we'll be better off when we perceive it that way, that this is not just some opportunity. If you can make the case for a certain thing being necessary on the form, that's certainly valid. But whether a date is put down or is accurate on a ballot that was received before the deadline seems to me largely irrelevant with regard to integrity, because there's no question that it was cast at least in a timely way, and then it can be reviewed for other aspects of validity like signature matching and things like that.
All right. One of the questions we also got from during the registration period, I understand that election officials are able to redact their personal information from public records. Is that true in Pennsylvania, Lauren? And David, if you can give a national perspective.
I don't know if that's true, actually. David, do you know?
So I don't know about Pennsylvania. I do know in most states there is an opportunity for not just election officials, but for some voters, depending upon who they are, to request that their voter registration record, which is otherwise public, and everyone should understand that the non confidential parts of your record. In other words, this won't include your driver's license number, your social, but your name, address, often political party, are part of a public record that almost anyone can get, and the parties and the campaigns have those guaranteed, and they use it for get out the vote operations to contact voters and try to persuade them and get them out to vote. There are people who, for a variety of reasons, want to keep their voter record private, mostly for their own safety. And so in many states, people who are in law enforcement, people who are victims of domestic abuse, people who might otherwise have reasonable fear for their safety can seek to have their record made confidential for that purpose, or parts of their record, like their address, be kept confidential. That's very common, and it usually the individual seeking that protection has to go through some steps to affirmatively ask for it. And by the way, anyone listening to this who thinks they might qualify, I would start with your state election website and search there. So in the case of Pennsylvania, it would be the Department of State, and see what you can find there. And it's usually, if it's available, it's usually something someone can find there.
NCSL has a webpage listing almost every state, I believe's different policy, and you can search for that look for the page called Summary Access to and Use of Voter Registration Lists. It gives you a table of every state breakdown and what's available and what's not available. Speaking of public safety, that unfortunately is a concern for a lot of election officials, not just in Pennsylvania. And Lauren, I just wonder, what is your sense of how are folks in Pennsylvania dealing with it at this moment, and how are they preparing for the general election coming up?
We at the Committee of 70 since 2020 have been hosting poll worker recruitment and information sessions. And since everything that happened in Georgia and even in Pennsylvania, every session in the Q&A portion has the question of, am I going to be safe if I do this? If I'm a poll worker, will I be safe? You know, in various iterations of that question. And overwhelmingly, yes, right? That there might be instances of friction, of people making a fuss or demanding to see, you know, information that they're not entitled to, things like that, that pops up. So in response to that, we're adding de-escalation training to our poll worker information sessions. And those will roll out over the summer and into the fall. And that's probably just good in general for all election administrators and probably all parents to take as well. But the instances of actual like law enforcement needing to step in to protect people are very few and far between. They're certainly prepared. I participated in our district attorney's election task force press conference yesterday with our city police commissioner and other members of law enforcement talking about their plans to keep people safe. And those plans are in place. And we don't anticipate there being numerous incidents that they're going to have to respond to, but everyone wants to know what the plan is should something arise.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, there absolutely is a concern for safety, and there have been unprecedented kind of threats and harassment directed at election officials nationwide. My organization had to found the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN. You can find it at eoldn.org. So we've recruited thousands of lawyers nationwide who are willing to serve pro bono to give advice to election officials who might feel that they're under threat or are being harassed in some way. And unfortunately, we're still seeing as many requests for that assistance as ever before. But, you know, to the bigger point, we are still seeing so many. We focus a lot on the election officials who've left, some of whom have left naturally for other reasons not related to anything that affects their safety. And what we often don't talk about is the fact that other election officials have stepped up to fill those roles and run very good elections since 2020 and 2022 and in the odd years of 21 and 23. And the poll workers are still volunteering. And I honestly, you know, I don't want to be a Pollyanna about this, but it actually inspires me to some degree to see, you know, hundreds of thousands of people stepping up for our democracy across the political spectrum to do this. And so I think, you know, especially if you know someone who has doubts or you might have doubts, if you want to understand more about elections, if you understand how hard it is to commit fraud, how almost certain it is that you'll get caught and prosecuted, how much our elections are checked and double checked through redundant teams of multiple people and through transparent processes that confirm the results all the time, how an election like 2020 that withstood more scrutiny than any election in world history could withstand that scrutiny. The best way to do it is to volunteer to be a poll worker. You'll find out exactly, you'll see in the training, you'll be inspired by your fellow volunteers. You'll work throughout the day and see the members of your community come out and express their voice. And very few people who've gone to volunteer to be a poll worker leave that process doubting that process. So I really highly encourage it. And I know election officials all over the country are working actively to make sure that even in the very unlikely event there was something that happened, that election officials and poll workers are going to be safe.
Lauren, is there a strategy, a program that's trying to boost poll worker recruitment in Pennsylvania that you know of?
Yes, absolutely. So we have the Committee of 70 is partnering with the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania statewide to do that recruitment effort. We need 40,000 poll workers twice a year, every year in Pennsylvania, 8,500 just in Philadelphia alone. And Power the Polls is a national organization that is coming back. They come in even number of years, it seems, to amplify that call for people to step up and exactly what that would take. So even our trainings, I don't want to call them trainings, but like information sessions, supplemental to the official trainings the counties provide, are for statewide poll workers, right? Any county can participate. So we're definitely the active voice on that recruitment effort here in Pennsylvania.
And we have a related question to that, and maybe I'll stay with you, Lauren, since it's more Pennsylvania specific. Can you talk about how election work safety issues may differ between different counties in Pennsylvania, that some may have a history of more turnover election officials or past election mistakes or controversies that may still reverberate in few upcoming elections?
Certainly, we applauded the Department of State added a new division within their administration to provide hands-on training for new election officials, because we did have that turnover. And as David said, part of it was just natural, the gray tsunami of people retiring from government. And that kind of hands-on support, a training, like actual unit to work with new administrators has been terrific. So that's something that gave us a little bit more confidence about all of these new people and their roles and the support that they were getting, especially since Act 88 kind of prevented that direct support from groups like Committee of 70. And I think also, being transparent about any mistakes. We did have, an incident in Northampton County and, things like that, an issue in Lackawanna County. The government has been transparent about what the issues were and the steps that they're taking to solve those problems, sharing those with other counties to make sure that they're not going to happen again there or anywhere else across the Commonwealth. So human error happens and people need to know that. It's not always, it's not some malicious conspiracy to overthrow the election. But as long as the government is transparent about it and taking steps to ensure that those mistakes aren't repeated, I think we're in good shape.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, there has been more turnover than in previous years. Some of it is ordinary turnover. Some of it probably is impacted by the harassment election officials have faced over the last several years. But again, what we're seeing, and I look at this nationwide, time and again, these roles are being filled by experienced people in almost every circumstance, which is good. Lauren is quite right. An election, we've never run a perfect election in the United States. It's impossible. We have 160 million Americans doing something they're not used to doing in a process run by 1 million volunteers that culminates on a single day. We're going to have problems. Some of those are things we can't do anything about. Weather problems, traffic problems, power outages. Some of those might be efforts to spread disinformation throughout the process, some of it coming from foreign adversaries. But some of them might be run-of-the-mill mistakes. But I can't stress this enough. This system that we have that's nearly 250 years old has evolved to the point where there's so many redundancies that the chance that any one of these things would affect the outcome of an election is exceedingly small. And so first of all, the process of the election is going to be good. Secondly, though, with regard specifically to the election workers, I know this is something, it's not something we paid a lot of attention to prior to 2020. The idea that someone would threaten an election worker was a foreign idea. Most election workers I know out there, most election officials had a hard enough time just getting anyone to understand what they did and care about what they do on a daily basis. I think now that's changed, and this is something that is a priority for election offices. So I expect that election officials will continue to be safe. If there are efforts to threaten polling places, voters, election offices, I've talked to election officials all over the country of both parties. I expect those will be dealt with very, very swiftly to make sure that all voters know that they can cast a ballot in convenience and safety.
Great. Thank you, David. We're almost at the end of the hour, and I'll just ask Lauren, is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to add before we hand it over to Liz to close this out?
Anybody in Pennsylvania can go to 70.org to check to type in their address and get their personalized ballot and do their homework before they head out to the polls. Please, please vote. Even if you think you know what's happening at the top of the ticket, there's a lot of important races here in Pennsylvania today, and we need everybody to make their values heard.